Socialism sucks. Wow. You really don't see a book title much more direct than that, do you? It's a deliberately provocative argument from a couple of economists, and in this explainer, we're going to break down exactly what they're arguing and why. So this book comes from two economists, Robert Lawson and Benjamin Powell, and they've pitched it as a kind of travelogue. I mean, they literally drink their way through what they call the unfree world to see the real-world impact of different economic systems, right up close. And they don't beat around the bush about why they wrote it. Right from the get-go, they say their mission is crystal clear. They believe that a lot of people are, in their words, dangerously ignorant about what socialism actually is and what its track record looks like. This quote is basically the launchpad for their entire argument. Okay, so their first major piece of evidence is a really stark, modern example that most of us have probably heard about: the economic collapse of Venezuela. The authors point out that it wasn't that long ago, back in 2013, that some commentators were actually holding up Venezuela as a kind of poster child for socialism. They highlight all this praise for its president's full-throated advocacy of socialism and what was even called a dream economic record. And this is where they trace what they see as this crucial shift in the whole narrative. You start in 2013 with all this high praise, right? But as the economy completely collapses and these horrific reports of hunger start coming out, they argue that by 2017, the story had totally changed. Suddenly, the same proponents were claiming, oh, well, that's not real socialism. For the authors, this moving of the goalposts is a key part of the debate they're trying to tackle. So, after making their point about Venezuela, the authors argue that the public debate kind of pivoted. They claim that proponents of socialism shifted their focus away from South America and all the way over to Scandinavia. And this leads to the question you always hear in this debate, and it's one the authors tackle head-on. Okay, fine. If Venezuela is a failure, then what about Sweden? Isn't that the perfect model for successful democratic socialism? And that is exactly why the author's journey starts in Sweden, to challenge that very idea. Their core argument is that Sweden isn't a socialist success story at all. Instead, they argue it's a wealthy capitalist country that can simply afford to have a massive welfare state. To back this up, they point to data from the Economic Freedom Index. And it's worth noting, one of the authors actually helps produce this index. But just look at the numbers. While Sweden gets a really low score for taxes and government spending, no surprise there, look at the other categories. It scores incredibly high on what the authors call the pillars of capitalism, protecting private property and the freedom to trade. This, they say, is why it still ranks among the most economically free countries in the world. And this leads to their core historical argument. They contend that a lot of people get the cause and effect here completely backward. They argue it wasn't the large welfare state that made Sweden rich. It was a century of free market capitalism that first created the enormous wealth needed to then fund that welfare state. This timeline really lays out their evidence. They point to a 100-year period of laissez-faire, free market policies, where Sweden became one of the richest nations on Earth. Then they highlight the period from 1960 to 1980, when government spending just exploded. And what happened after? According to their data, Sweden's ranking among the world's wealthiest nations actually fell from 4th down to 14th. Now, this whole argument really hinges on definitions. To follow their logic, we need to understand exactly how the authors define socialism. For Lawson and Powell, socialism isn't just about high taxes or a big welfare state. They use a much more fundamental historical definition: the abolition of private property and complete government control over the economy, what gets produced and for whom. This specific definition is the absolute bedrock of their entire argument. So here's the contrast they draw. On one side, you've got their definition of socialism: government controls production. On the other, capitalism, which they define by respect for private property and the freedom to trade. And those, they argue, are the very things that make Sweden's economy so strong. So after using Sweden to establish their definitions, the authors set off to explore countries that they believe fit the bill of real socialism much more closely. Their tour of the unfree world takes them to places they identify as almost entirely socialist, like North Korea and Cuba, as well as former Soviet states still dealing with the legacy of that system. And this is the central question the book leaves us with. By exploring these different nations, what can we really learn about the link between economic systems and human prosperity? The author's argument is a provocative one, for sure, that true prosperity comes from economic freedom, and that the definitions we use in this debate, well, they might just matter more than anything else.